September 8, 1900, 6:42 a.m. Isaac Cline stepped onto the porch of his home on Avenue Q in Galveston, Texas, and looked at the Gulf of Mexico. The water was already over the streets. Not from rain, from the ocean. The sea was pushing inland with a force Cline had never seen before. He got on his horse and rode along the beach for 3 miles, stopping at every house he passed, telling people to move to higher ground. There was no higher ground in Galveston. The entire island sat an average of 4.5 feet above sea level. The highest point was 8.5 feet. By the time Cline finished his ride, the water was already knee-deep in the streets. By nightfall, it would be 15 feet deep, and 8,000 people would be dead. Galveston in 1900 was the most important city in Texas. Not Houston, Galveston. It was the largest port on the Gulf Coast. Cotton, grain, and goods moved through its docks in volumes that made it one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the United States. 37,000 people lived on a barrier island 30 miles off the Texas coast. An island 2 miles wide at its widest point, completely exposed to the Gulf of Mexico. The residents of Galveston understood they lived on a sandbar. They had watched hurricanes come through before. Smaller storms had flooded the low-lying areas and retreated. The city had survived them all. There had been discussions for years about building a seawall. The cost was prohibitive. The storms had not been bad enough to justify it. The city decided a seawall was unnecessary. That decision would cost 8,000 lives. The storm that would destroy Galveston began as a tropical disturbance off the west coast of Africa in late August 1900. It moved west across the Atlantic, strengthening as it crossed the Caribbean. The United States Weather Bureau tracked it. They had reports from Cuba indicating a major storm was moving toward the Gulf of Mexico. The Cuban meteorologist Lorenzo Gangoiti had been warning for days that this storm was heading toward the Texas coast. The United States Weather Bureau dismissed his warnings. There was an institutional rivalry between the American Bureau and the Cuban meteorologists that led American forecasters to systematically discount Cuban reports. This rivalry was not scientific. It was political, and it cost lives. Isaac Cline himself had written a paper in 1891 arguing that it was impossible for a catastrophic hurricane to strike Galveston. He had argued that the gradual slope of the Gulf floor would reduce any storm surge before it reached the island. He had argued that the island's geography provided natural protection. He was wrong. On September 7th, the Weather Bureau issued advisories indicating rough weather was approaching the Gulf Coast. Not evacuation warnings, not urgent alerts. Advisories. The kind of communication that causes people to put their boats in dry storage and board up their beach houses. Not the kind that causes 37,000 people to leave an island. On the morning of September 8th, the storm made landfall directly over Galveston. What happened to Galveston on September 8, 1900, was not just a storm. It was a 15-foot wall of water that crossed the entire island from south to north. The storm surge arrived before the worst winds. Water began pushing into the streets in the early morning hours. By noon, the lowest areas were under several feet of water. By early afternoon, the streets were rivers. By evening, the water was rising so fast that families who had moved to second floors found themselves moving to roofs. Then the roofs began to go. The wind speeds were estimated at over 140 miles per hour. At those speeds, wood frame houses did not stand. They came apart. The debris from the first houses to fail became weapons that destroyed the next houses. 6,000 homes were destroyed. Some neighborhoods ceased to exist entirely. Not damaged. Gone. The boards and timbers and bricks of Galveston's houses were swept across the island in a moving debris field that crushed everything in its path. People who survived described clinging to wreckage for hours in darkness and wind and water. Families were separated. Children were swept from parents' arms. The sound of the storm, survivors said, was constant and total. Not loud the way a thunderstorm is loud. Loud in a way that made individual sounds impossible to distinguish. Everything was the storm. Isaac Cline survived by clinging to debris for 3 hours in the dark. His brother Joseph survived. Isaac's wife did not. She was found days later in the wreckage of their home. The Weather Bureau office was destroyed. The records were lost. The anemometer that measured wind speed blew away at 102 miles per hour. The actual peak wind speed was never recorded. In the days after the storm, Galveston counted its dead. The count took weeks because the bodies were everywhere. Under debris, in the Gulf, washed into the bay, found miles from where they had lived. The final official count was 8,000 dead. Historians believe the actual number may have been as high as 12,000. Approximately 1 in 5 residents of Galveston was killed in a single night. The bodies were so numerous that burial was impossible. The city loaded bodies onto barges and took them out to sea. The sea returned them. They tried again. The sea returned them again. Eventually, the city built funeral pyres and burned the dead in the streets. The smell of the fires carried for miles. The question that survivors and investigators asked in the weeks after the storm was simple. Could this have been prevented? Not the hurricane. The death toll. 3 separate failures had combined to produce 8,000 dead. The first failure was the seawall decision. Galveston had been warned for years that its position on a low-lying barrier island made it vulnerable to exactly this kind of storm surge. Engineers had proposed a seawall that would have reduced the storm surge's impact on the city. The city had declined to fund it. Cost was the stated reason. The cost of not building it was 8,000 lives. The second failure was the Weather Bureau's dismissal of Cuban warnings. Lorenzo Gangoiti had tracked the storm accurately. He had communicated its probable path. American meteorologists had the information and had chosen not to act on it aggressively because of institutional rivalry. The storm's path was predictable. The warnings were available. The decision to minimize them was institutional. The third failure was the evacuation non-decision. There was no evacuation order issued for Galveston on September 7th or September 8th. Not because officials did not know a storm was coming. Because they did not understand how catastrophic it would be. Because Isaac Cline had told them in 1891 that catastrophic storms could not strike Galveston. His own paper had shaped the thinking of the people who should have ordered an evacuation. His own confidence in his own incorrect analysis contributed to the deaths of 8,000 people. He spent the rest of his career revising that analysis. The rebuilding of Galveston produced 2 engineering decisions that changed how America thinks about coastal cities. The first was the seawall. Construction began in 1902. The initial seawall was 17 feet high and 10 miles long. It took 2 years to build. It was extended multiple times over the following decades. Today, the Galveston seawall is more than 10 miles long and 17 feet high at its base. When Hurricane Ike struck Galveston in 2008 with a storm surge of 15 feet, the seawall held. The areas behind the seawall were largely protected. The areas outside the seawall were devastated. The 1900 hurricane killed 8,000 people. Ike killed 84 in Galveston. The difference was the seawall. The second decision was the grade raising. The city pumped sand from the Gulf floor and raised the elevation of the entire island. 17 million cubic yards of sand. The grade of the city was raised by as much as 17 feet in the areas closest to the beach. Buildings were lifted by hydraulic jacks as the sand was pumped beneath them. Churches, houses, hotels raised on jacks while the city was lifted beneath them. It was one of the largest civil engineering projects in American history to that point. The Weather Bureau response to Galveston changed American meteorology permanently. The institutional dismissal of Cuban warnings was investigated and the policy was changed. American forecasters began cooperating with Cuban and Caribbean meteorologists rather than competing with them. The hurricane forecasting network that exists today, the coordination between the National Hurricane Center and meteorological services across the Caribbean, has direct roots in the failure that contributed to Galveston's death toll. The concept of hurricane preparedness as a governmental responsibility rather than an individual choice was born in Galveston's wreckage. Before 1900, Americans understood hurricanes as acts of God. After 1900, Americans understood that the death toll from a hurricane was also the product of human decisions. The decision to build a seawall. The decision to issue an evacuation order. The decision to listen to warnings from sources outside your own institution. Those decisions determined who lived and who died. They still do. Galveston was never again the most important city in Texas. The hurricane and the long rebuilding process allowed Houston, 30 miles inland, to develop its port and its economy. By 1910, Houston had surpassed Galveston in population. By 1930, it was not close. The storm that killed 8,000 people also ended Galveston's era as the commercial capital of Texas. The seawall stands. The grade-raised streets sit higher than they did in 1900. The houses that survived are still there. If you walk the beach in Galveston today and stand at the base of the seawall, you are standing at the exact elevation where the storm surge stopped in 2008. 15 feet of water, held back by concrete. The concrete that 8,000 people paid for, with their lives, before anyone decided to build it. Did you know the Galveston Hurricane was the deadliest natural disaster in American history? Tell me in the comments what you think should have been done differently.